Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Well, super excited about today's guest. We've got Zaid Dahhaj, and he is an expert in circadian biology. We're going to be talking all about the sun cream myth and sunlight and health and mitochondria and plenty of good stuff. So, welcome to the channel, mate.
Thank you, my friend. Definitely excited for the conversation here.
You've got some amazing threads on X, which I stumbled across recently, and we've been having these amazing doctors and guests on talking about all this stuff and exposing the sort of the big corporate machine and the lies. But what's your backstory? How did you get into all this and end on this path?
Well, mine was an interesting one. I think it had a lot of twists and turns, as most people's lives have. And so I started as a soccer player at the age of 4. My dad helped me in a big way to get into the game, and I started watching soccer at an early age too, and I just wanted to be a professional soccer player ever since I was 4 years old. So I pursued that until I was like 24, 25. But the real pivotal experience for me was around 18 when my father passed from heart disease. It was a very tough time for me. He had 2 heart attacks within the span of a year. And so that got me really interested into the health perspective of things. And I really wanted to go deeper and understand the first principles behind it. But I was kind of lost because I had to start from ground zero, right? So for me, it was the steady and long process of going through like detoxification, nutrition, all this other stuff. And then eventually I found circadian biology a few years back. And the moment I discovered that work through Dr. Jack Cruz, I was like, there is no going back. Like, this is the thing that I'm going to focus on because I'm very soul oriented, you could say. I like to resonate with things and I just go with it essentially. And so from there, it evolved into creating content on various platforms. It evolved into working with people one on one to give them a circadian foundation to not only optimize health, but also prevent chronic disease, because I think chronic disease is a easily preventable thing if you have some good lifestyle foundations in place. And then, it's just taken on a life of its own essentially from that point.
Amazing. And I think more and more of people are realizing that nature does things the right way. And anytime we try to interfere, particularly with that circadian rhythm, with people, inside in these artificial lights these days and living in cities and all this type of thing. So, do you want to maybe touch on some of that stuff first before we dive into the juicy sort of sunscreen and skin health debate and all that?
Sure. I think the necessary context here is that society is essentially built to create circadian disruption. And so, logically speaking, you can see how that's a problem for a circadian species whose every aspect of their body is designed around circadian mechanisms. And so, if we're talking about sunlight avoidance, if we're talking about the modern, what I call propaganda from centralized dermatology and other industries, we talk about artificial light exposure, especially at night. I think that all of this ties into really creating a situation where we are at an increased risk of chronic disease, and it's taking a toll on society. And I think it's a huge causal factor to why we see skyrocketing rates of disease, especially skin cancers. So for me, I think that's a necessary context to understand. And there are many glaring contradictions within the mainstream narrative involved with sunlight exposure. And really, my work revolves around trying to pinpoint all of those contradictions and educate people from a first principles, but also easily understandable standpoint so that they can understand this work from a more directionally accurate perspective.
So, how deep down the rabbit hole do you go when it comes to the history of this stuff and the different effects from, say, going from candlelight to the analog early bulbs that we used to have to now these, blue light, LED, flickering, all this type of stuff? Sort of, yeah, talk about that progression and who you think's behind it and that type of thing as well.
Mm. Yeah, I think we can go way back. I mean, a couple hundred years, all the way to 1879 when artificial light was first introduced by, I think, Thomas Edison and some other folks. And so that's, I think, the starting point of where we see this progression into to nowadays these insane artificial lighting systems that have this high spike of isolated blue without any red or infrared, high flicker rate, a lot of non-native EMF. And so I think that's been a pro and a con. It's offered society a few benefits, but I think from my perspective and from the circadian perspective, it's offered a lot more damage than I think pros. And so if we understand how lighting has progressed ever since 1879, we've essentially gone from an incandescent bulb, which is a much healthier lighting or form factor for light, all the way to these modern LEDs and fluorescents, which are just horrendous for the circadian system. I mean, you could talk about processes like ferroptosis within the body, an iron-dependent form of cell death that causes havoc systemically. The circadian disruption piece, proven to cause cancer in human beings, proven to cause pre-diabetes and insulin dysregulation, blood glucose dysregulation, all that stuff. And I think it's been a real problem that many people have not noticed. And I think for good reason, because there are a lot of actors in the past, let's say like J.D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie, and figures within history, within that time frame, that have pushed their own agenda, which has led to the suppression of a lot of this information. And even in the early 1900s, you have, Niels Rieberg-Finsen won the Nobel Prize for studying UV light's effects on chronic inflammatory skin conditions. He studied red light and smallpox. He had some incredible results. And then eventually Niels Rieberg-Finsen Augusto Rollier a few years later took his work and essentially started the first heliotherapy clinic in Switzerland at high altitude. And so there's a lot involved here, but I think that when you understand the historical perspective, it begins to make sense that full spectrum sunlight has been demonized and circadian disruption and artificial light has been unrecognized.
Yeah. For people at home, just describe heliotherapy, what you mean exactly for that, for those that are unaware.
Super simple. It's just sun therapy. So you can think of it as essentially just sunbathing.
Yeah.
But, I think Augusto Rollier had a very good understanding of this work and how to sunbathe progressively. But I do also think he missed a few important things. I think the nighttime darkness was an important one that he could have potentially missed. Yeah. But then even when I think about it, like naturally in the early 1900s, you had more darkness with healthier lighting like incandescence. But either way, it's just sun therapy done progressively in order to build melanin, heal inflammatory skin conditions, build up vitamin D3, build up endogenous melatonin. The list goes on. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and we see those photos of hospitals with sick patients on the roof getting fresh air and getting sunlight back in the day, and now when you're in hospital, you're under those artificial lights in these tiny box rooms. You're eating bad food. It's like the worst environment to heal, isn't it?
Yeah, I often say it's not an environment for healing, and so I think that's one part ignorance, and for a very, very real reason, that's one part intentional as well, malicious.
Yeah. Completely agree. Well, there's a couple of paths we can go from here. So a lot of this blue LED lights has been sold under, energy efficiency and that ties into maybe some of the climate change stuff or whatever. But do you think that they are actually that more energy efficient, or is there the technology to make safe light that is also just as energy efficient type of thing?
I do think they are more energy efficient if you're talking about the cost, purely the cost. But even then, it's marginal. Like I recently did a comparison between incandescents and LEDs, and you would be shocked to find that the cost is not that crazy actually for a few bulbs around the house.
Yeah,
and you're going to be using them less anyways. So why does it matter? Yeah. I think from that perspective, I don't know if you can make energy efficient circadian friendly lights to the same degree, because you have to have infrared, and infrared is what gives off the heat.
Yeah.
But either way, I think that's an important discussion, and just the modern forms of lighting are atrocious. There's no way around it. Like it just destroys the skin, the eyes, the brain, and everything else involved with health, especially how you, I think, psychologically interface with reality as well. I mean, low dopamine and melatonin behavior is a huge problem in this day and age.
Yeah. It's so funny when you say that. What comes to mind when we talk about our Bitcoin research and people are familiar with the term fiat currency, where currencies are being debased, and then we have this term of fiat food, where nutritious food is being debased for profit, how cheap you can make it. Now we have almost fiat lighting. It's like, what's the cheapest way we can do it, but that's dangerous for your health at the same point. That's the trade-off, as you've highlighted there.
Yeah. And Dr. Jack Kruse talks about the parallels of decentralized money and decentralized health all the time.
Yeah, awesome. So what do you think are the main things that this influences the body? You touched on dopamine, serotonin then. Is it our entire chemistry that can get out of whack with the circadian rhythm being out of whack and nighttime lighting? And where do you want to go from here in relation to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you are correct, because I think if you look at the circadian system, it's all about timing, essentially. The human body is, in my mind, the most sophisticated circadian and electromagnetic clock around. And so if you can understand how to have a circadian-friendly lifestyle to make sure the clocks within your body are timed correctly, then you're going to get good health. If you do the opposite, you're likely to get bad health. And so for me, if you look at like, the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, that's the master circadian clock. And for example, when you wake up to watch sunrise, that light gets into the eyes peripherally, or directly if you're sun gazing, and it basically sends a signal to the SCN to start the process up from a circadian timing perspective. Yeah. And then that master clock sends a signal to all the peripheral clocks, which are attached to every organ, every cell, every protein in your body. I mean, you name a part of the body, there are many circadian clocks involved, and those are the peripheral clocks.
Yeah.
And so, if we can understand how to utilize timing of light correctly, timing of food correctly, temperature, exercise, social interactions, all of these things are what we call Zeitgebers, which are external circadian cues. So they're basically things that set the time in the body correctly. And there are improper ways to use those inputs as well. But I think if you're looking at the downstream consequences, if you are chronically circadian disrupted, then your SCN is not working properly. The rest of the body isn't getting the signal to work, on a time of day dependent manner. And so that can lead to things like prediabetes or increased plaque in the arteries, or, reduced brain function. Essentially every symptom that we see in society can be traced back to this root cause of circadian disruption, which is why I stand so firmly on trying to educate people on it.
Yeah, and a lot of this with our health or with our sun exposure, it's all just getting back to basics, the way that humans lived before we were sort of domesticated, really, isn't it? So do you want to maybe run through that ideal day of timing of sun exposure and dark for sleep? And you touched on sun gazing. And again, I was one of those people that just thought you're not meant to look at the sun until I started sun gazing in the early hours or the very late hours, sunset or sunrise. And it's an amazing experience, and the sun looks completely different. And after about 15 seconds, your eyes adjust and it's fine. It's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. A profound spiritual experience, in my opinion, as well. I think there are many layers to this work, emotional, physical, mental, and then spiritual. And so if we look at the ideal day from a circadian standpoint, I think watching sunrise is the first domino that you push. And so I usually wake up 5 to 10 minutes prior to sunrise, and I just get outside immediately. You don't have to necessarily see the sun at the horizon. The most important thing is that you're outside, because the entire external environment is bathed in that light spectrum. But it is even better to see the sunrise on the horizon if you can. And so spending as much time as you can in the morning time. If you want to implement a proper sunbathing protocol, then you will have to be more diligent about getting most of the skin exposed during this early AM time, for many different reasons that we can discuss. But outside of that, it's generally just trying to work as much as you can outside if possible, taking breaks, eating lunch outside, having breakfast within the first hour of that sunrise portion all the way up to UVA is very important as well, for leptin signaling and metabolism and all this other stuff. And then, you head into midday where you sunbathe moderately and progressively. No use of sunglasses, sunscreen, any of that, mainstream nonsense, in my opinion, that is fundamentally iatrogenic, just causes harm to people over the long term. And then after that, I think you head into the evening time where sunset comes into play. You watch that as much as you can. And then after that, once nightfall hits, it's full dark mode. That's where you have the duality of the light and dark cycle. Circadian timing is essentially described or epitomized by this sharp distinction in bright light during the daytime under full spectrum sunlight, and then dark nights with minimal circadian lighting. So you want to have that duality in check. And then outside of that, being asleep before 10 p.m. And I think, of course, there's a seasonal shift and variation to this. So the timing of sunrise and sunset will change according to the time of year. But other than that, the rest is finer details, in my opinion. Yeah. I think non-native EMF is important. There are some other important fundamentals, but the rest is finer details.
Yeah, we'll get into some of the EMF stuff later a bit as well. But let's dive into the juicy stuff then, because I know in Australia, some of the highest rates of skin cancer in the world, one of the biggest slip, slop, slap campaigns. Everyone's got sunglasses on and that type of thing. Another thing is I don't know how much of this is propaganda, but the hole in the ozone layer that was meant to be just over certain regions of Australia, and now some people say that's healed or whatever. Again, I haven't been down that rabbit hole myself, but Yeah, talk to us about maybe. I'm not sure if you've got specific info in Australia, but we've pretty much seen similar trends in the West about this fear campaign. And again, getting back to nature, I just say to people, well, if the sun's been around for millions of years, billions of years, whatever, no other animals are wearing sun cream and sunglasses. And some of these new studies that are coming out showing that actually affects the rates you burn, all this type of thing. So yeah, give us your spill on everything you've learned on that front.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. I think, but we can synthesize it into a more easily understandable framework. I think number one, the ozone hole layer. There's a lot of misinformation about that. It does exist, but it is healing. I think the rate is like at 2040 or 2060, it should be fully healed. But there was, there are these manufacturing gases that have been released ever since I think the 1987 Montreal Project or Act, and those contributed heavily to the destruction of the ozone layer.
Yeah.
Now, am I going to make the case that without the ozone layer, sunlight is more harmful? I would just say that you're more likely to burn rather quickly. But outside of that, there is also a seasonal variation to the ozone layer. And Australia specifically, it actually mainly takes place over Antarctica. But because of the seasonal shift, it transitions over Australia during specific times of year.
Okay.
When it comes to skin cancer rates, I mean, obviously all skin cancers are skyrocketing across the world for very real reasons. But an interesting thing that I would think about is what are the skin cancer rates of the Aboriginals in Australia? That's an important factor because if you take a look at them, fully melanated, dark skin, I would argue that they're living in their ancestral environment, and so their rates of skin cancer are almost non-existent. But if you look at Australians or people who have gone to New Zealand, these are people who are fundamentally European origin, and so their relationship to high UV is going to be much different. They're going to have to be much more intentional about high UV exposure. But either way, they can thrive with a proper circadian framework. So my argument is that you have a people who is not evolved essentially for a high UV index environment, but they can adapt to a certain degree. These people are also chronically circadian disrupted, meaning all of their anti-cancer processes, which are under circadian control, are destroyed over time, over decades, meaning the very anti-cancer defenses that are supposed to defend you from cancer manifestation are broken. So that's a big problem fundamentally. You have the slip, slop, slap campaign. So people are mostly avoiding the sun or using quote unquote protection in order to avoid the quote unquote negative effects that are offered according to the centralized narrative. And then you have other things, sleep deprivation, artificial light exposure at night, which has been proven to cause cancer in humans, altered spectrums from low emission glass in buildings and cars. You have tanning beds, which I think are problematic because of isolated UV, high oxidized PUFA consumption, polyunsaturated fatty acids in the form of seed oils. There's a lot that play into this cancer manifestation on a population level. And my argument is that it's not inherently the sun; it's all the other crap that has come around recently that has broken people's circadian system chronically.
Yeah, no, it's always multifactorial with all the pesticides, herbicides, junk food, everything that's causing, all these disruptions in how our cells should healthily function and turn over and so on. But you touched on the seed oils there. So I had read some of the stuff about this. If you start eating those types of fats, it changes the integrity of your skin and those layers, and those types of fats are actually more likely to burn or to turn cancerous under natural UV exposure than natural animal fats. Is that all correct in your research?
I think it's directionally accurate. I mean, we're not going to find a really strong study to show it within the centralized scientific framework because it takes money and it takes time and it takes the wisdom to know about a certain study that needs to be run. And so I think there's enough evidence to point in that direction. Logically, it makes sense from a mechanistic standpoint that if your cell membranes or a big part of your cells are made up of the fat that you consume dietary wise, then the quality of the fat dictates the quality of your cell or your body from a cellular perspective. And so we have to consider that these seed oils are already oxidized before you consume them. And they go through like a 12 to 24 step manufacturing process, which it essentially weakens the system to a certain degree. Now, I will say you don't have to completely avoid seed oils. I've seen people and I've worked with people who have just reduced them dramatically to the point where they get incredible benefit from high UV index solar exposure that's done moderately and intentionally. But outside of that, I think they're just better to avoid in general, and you're better off of consuming saturated fats or extra virgin olive oil, monounsaturated fats, that sort of thing.
You touched on native Aboriginal Australians or natives to any region being acclimatized and adapted to their environment. Have you seen much research around how long that takes? And for someone that is getting super healthy sun exposure and eating a good diet, how many generations does it take for that to really become more of a genetic trait, I guess, that is passed on and adapted over time?
Yeah, very, very tough question in my mind. I think that we're starting to see some scenarios where, mitochondrial heteroplasmy comes into play, because fundamentally you get all of your mitochondria from your mother. And so if your mother has dysfunctional mitochondria to a certain degree, that's going to translate into your health. And so we're just talking about basically the health span of your mitochondria. Okay. Some people could have mitochondria that are very healthy, and other people can have, and actually you can have unhealthy mitochondria or damaged mitochondria in other places of the body. And so this is why I think we can explain some cases like babies who have cancer or some other crazy disease. But fundamentally, I think that people have a lot more control in this discussion. Just because your mom had poor mitochondrial health doesn't mean you're doomed to the same outcome as she is. And so there are very simple circadian steps that you can follow in order to build more mitochondrial resilience, because mitochondria are circadian light sensing organelles that respond very quickly to the right inputs. So I'm more concerned with epigenetics rather than genetics. Genetics is interested in nuclear DNA, which is what mainstream science focuses on. And then epigenetics is more so the study of, mitochondria and how your body changes gene expression through lifestyle actions. Yes. And so that's something that is not covered by mainstream medicine as much as nuclear DNA. And there's a great researcher by the name of Dr. William Wallace, who's one of the premier mitochondrial researchers. And he talks about this connection essentially to mitochondrial collapse and all of chronic disease, essentially.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. So let's dive into some of the natural protection mechanisms that our skin and the sebum and sweat and all that stuff, how does that all work in an ideal healthy person, and how is that protecting the skin, building a tan naturally, and helping mitochondria and everything else?
Well, we do have to understand that, like every other part of the body, the skin barrier is a circadian organ. So just full stop. If it's a circadian organ, you need to be fully aligned and in full circadian alignment to make sure the skin barrier works properly. And so if you look at the layers of the skin barrier, you start at the epidermis, then you go down to the dermis, hypodermis. These aspects of the skin barrier are all light sensing. They all have light sensing proteins known as opsins, or non-visual photoreceptors. We can think of like melanopsin, the blue light sensor. Neuropsin is a UVA light sensor. And these are designed to sense light and use it to go about circadian timing and many other functions. If you look at like collagen production, elastin production, also follow circadian timing. If you look at the relationship between the DNA mutations that UV light causes in people, also known as thymin dimers, the circadian system has a perfect push and pull to this, meaning that vitamin D3, UVB specifically causes thymin dimers, but UVB also creates vitamin D3, which happens to heal or correct thymin dimers immediately on the spot. All anti-cancer processes are at their peak essentially during midday UV, because that's when you have the highest intensity radiation. And so, there's so much to talk about this, but again, every aspect of this is under circadian control, and you need to make sure that you time your light correctly. So watching that sunrise, getting that AM sunlight before UV, progressively exposing your skin to that UV to avoid burns, to properly build melanin through melanogenesis, which is the process of building melanin. And then, of course, the nighttime darkness is very important, because interestingly enough, and this is something dermatologists don't talk about, is that the skin actually regenerates itself comprehensively at night while using darkness, while at sleep. And so those are all very important factors to understand how to get the most out of skin health, and fundamentally how to understand that there's a lot of BS in the idea that full spectrum sunlight causes skin cancers or photoaging.
So it's the micro scale of the morning sunrise all the way through to the macro stuff of building a tan gradually and letting your skin adapt and build more melanin before you spend more time in the sun. Just common sense things, really, isn't it?
Exactly, but through the lens of through the circadian lens, because all of this works together as one unit. It's all a synchronized play, and so if you're somebody who skips the AM morning time but you go straight to intense UV, then your body is essentially not prepared for that UV because you haven't given it the circadian signal in the morning.
Yeah.
And so there are downstream consequences to that. And if you're somebody who gets bright artificial light at night, but you completely skip the morning sunlight and the midday sunlight, that's where you start to see the breakdown in this highly complex system of the skin barrier. And that's where you start to see things like hypopigmentation, hyperpigmentation, melasma, eczema. All these other manifestations are fundamentally circadian in nature. And so that's really the root cause that I try to push here.
Fantastic. So let's dive into the real juicy stuff, the sort of history of sunscreens. I think more and more people are waking up to skin products in general, and getting away from chemicals and seeking more natural alternatives. But how did we get here? Give us the history of sunscreens and how they actually, in some of this new science, can maybe worsen skin cancer and cause skin cancer.
Yeah, well, I'm a very, very forthright in telling people like what areas I don't understand completely. I think the history of how sunscreen began is not something that I understand totally. I think it began in the early 1900s, around that time after the 1910 Flexner report, I believe. And so it could be 1915, 1920, something of that nature. And I think Coco Chanel actually came out with the first concept of the sunscreen. Could be wrong on that. But either way, you progressively see the introduction of sunscreen use along with these centralized notions of sun avoidance and sun protection. And I think that's been a very intentional process from, conglomerates like L'Oreal and Nestle, who in the 50s, 60s, and 70s actually used PR campaigns in the public to get people scared of full spectrum sunlight exposure so that they could sell more sunscreens on the back end along with their other products.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of malice involved here. The connection between sunscreen use and the prevention of skin cancers is very weak. I mean, there are meta-analyses on there that show that sunscreen is not protective of skin cancers at all. These are meta-analyses that compile 300,000 participants, dozens of studies. You would assume that if the mainstream narrative was correct, then you would see a positive signal for them across the board, but you don't. There are a lot of contradictions in the research. And then I think other problems involved with sunscreen that are very problematic in my mind over the long term are things like the artificial manipulation of the full spectrum. If we understand sunlight, it's a perfect symphony of different balanced wavelengths. And so, infrared makes up 50 to 55% of the total spectrum. Visible makes up around 42 to 45% with red included. Think of red and infrared light therapy. And then UV light actually makes up only 3 to 5% of the total spectrum. So if you look through the literature, you'll find that red and infrared have this incredible hormetic effect to balance out UV exposure along with blue. And so, there was even a recent study, not even recent, it was a 1998 study in the Journal of Dermatology. It showed that non-coherent near-infrared light completely stopped cytotoxicity or cell toxicity from UV exposure in isolation. And so there's a synergistic dance involved here. But of course, the problem is that centralized research uses isolated UV on nocturnal animals or skin cell cultures, which is totally asinine study design. And then other things with sunscreen, I think, photocarcinogens like avobenzone, oxybenzone are a big problem. These are compounds that inherently are not really problematic, but when they interact with high UV, high heat and light, they become photocarcinogens that, create excess reactive oxygen species within the skin barrier and systemically. And it's essentially throwing your body out of whack because ROS and RNS are key signaling molecules that are responsible for many different things that are beneficial for your health. But the moment you introduce sunscreen, you create this free radical damage, essentially runaway phenomenon that leads to oxidative damage, which funny enough is the hallmark of cancer. And so many different problems involved. Chemical-based sunscreens are terrible. There are
nanoparticles. Nanoparticles as well these days have been spoken about more and more in sunscreens.
Yeah, there's a whole rabbit hole on that. It's not as as great as people make it out to be. It's not as rigorously tested as people make it out to be. And so from any angle, you can talk about sunscreen and basically point out the glaring contradictions from a circadian standpoint.
And so, what are the more natural options? People, beef tallow, zinc based. What do you think are the best, natural products?
Yeah, I'm actually for none of that. I am for, I mean, you could use coconut oil on the skin or beef tallow. That's no problem. That's not going to be problematic in my mind. But I am more an advocate of getting into circadian alignment because the body knows how to do this through a circadian system. So, the AM sunbathing is essentially I view midday sunbathing as a training session. So the AM sunbathing is a warm up that primes the skin. It creates skin proteins like filigrean uricanic acid, which are protective and moisturizing of the skin. It actually has an SPF factor to it, I think of about 15. But the most important part of this is that in circadian alignment, it allows you the leverage to build more melanin. And melanin is nature's sunscreen. You have eumelanin, responsible for blacks and browns in nature, blocks 99.9% of UV while using the rest for systemic benefit. And then pheomelanin in lighter skinned people is responsible for the reds, yellows, oranges, pinks in nature. That blocks around 20 to 40% of UV light. But again, you can get to the point where you can progressively build more melanin and avoid burns completely and get positive results across the board. And to prove this point, even from an anecdotal perspective, I have redheads, the most susceptible type of people to burn, avoiding burns and getting positive outcomes with this work. So if it works for them, it works for everybody. And I think the most important thing is that melanin is nature's most effective sunscreen. And it also comes with many other benefits, which the dermatologists don't know about, which is why they say that a tan or melanin production is a sign of skin or DNA damage.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. Anything else you wanted to dive into on this topic? Chronic skin exposure, leathery skin. You touched on the fair skin there. Is there anything else people know before we maybe touch on some different topics?
I think any skin manifestation that is negative is a direct result from a broken circadian system and broken circadian skin clocks fundamentally. And so, of course, there are other things that play a role, but you have to understand that the body is very intelligent and wise in how it operates. And so if you introduce a circadian species and throw it into a society that disrupts the circadian system chronically, you're going to get all sorts of weird manifestations that, funny enough, dermatologists just blame on the sun, which is, obviously not accurate because they're not taught circadian biology in their curriculum.
Yeah. I want to dive into some more stuff about EMF. So for people at home, I think most people understand, the light spectrum and visible light is this tiny fraction. Then we have microwaves through to ultraviolet light, infrared, everything in between. And once you go down the rabbit hole of science and how atoms work, you find out that everything is kind of energy and waves and that type of thing. So with all this interacting, I think more and more people are questioning, microwaves, smart devices, 5G towers. And even throughout history, there's some people that say that a lot of people started to get sick when they rolled out original electricity towers and put it into homes and all around people in the environment. So are you familiar with much of that research, or just what are your thoughts on the actual dangers of these different types of EMF radiation and frequencies?
Yeah, well, I'm familiar with it to a very surface level degree. I think there are people like Tristan Scott who are, well versed in this. I think he was an electrical engineer. But for me, I think that we have to understand the difference between native EMF that the Earth provides for our species and then non-native EMF. And non-native EMF, I think, is problematic because the entire body is tuned to natural EMF. The mitochondria evolved to sense natural EMF, like the Schumann resonance from the Earth, geomagnetic fields. Grounding is a big discussion that ties into this subject. And I think the mitochondria are very sensitive circadian electromagnetic organelles. I mean, this is some of the strongest science that we know of. Like Nick Lane has talked about the electrical gradient or, electrical charge on the inner mitochondrial membrane. The amount of electricity all your mitochondria produce within the body is just incredible. And so the body also operates through piezoelectricity, flexoelectricity. These are all phenomenons that fundamentally involve electromagnetic processes. And so for me, it's very problematic to introduce foreign frequencies at various levels to the mitochondria, which then interrupt how they are supposed to work from a sophisticated standpoint. I mean, people talk about calcium, voltage-gated calcium channels and too much calcium within the system. Again, this is something that I know at a very surface level, but I do think it's very problematic, and it ties directly into the circadian discussion as well.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And as you say, there's some pretty strong science around a lot of this stuff now, and people thinking that concepts like grounding are a bit woo-woo, but now we know, you can measure the Earth's natural frequency and those ions from nature and that type of thing, can't you?
Yeah. And even the work of, let's say, Dr. Robert O. Becker in the 50s or 60s, like his study on limb regeneration as it relates to electromagnetic frequencies, more so direct current as opposed to alternative current, was groundbreaking stuff. I mean, to the point where, institutions like the Department of Defense and government shut them down for spilling a lot of their dirty work around submarine bases and implementing these non-native EMF form factors into society. And so this is a big problem that I think gets swept under the rug. And people need to understand that there are big actors who are incentivized to sweep it under the rug, because of course you don't want telecom companies being told that all of their technology is damaging to the population. It just doesn't make sense for them.
Yeah. So, what are the best ways to keep mitochondria healthy, in your opinion? Is it just eating a well-balanced diet, or is there specific foods? And the same with exercise. We hear maybe high intensity or weightlifting is better than aerobic. So, what's the best ways to look after the mitochondria?
For me, it goes back to the circadian fundamentals first and foremost. So, watching the sunrise, ideally being grounded as much as you can, more so in nature as opposed to cities. Midday sunbathing is absolutely powerful for mitochondrial function and health. Nighttime darkness is also very important because these are, organelles that are tied to the light and dark cycle. Eating a well-balanced, nutrient-dense diet is very important in my mind. But I will take it a step further and say that eating a seasonal and local nutrient-dense diet is probably the best thing around, because, your mitochondria are kind of, they kind of sense food as an electromagnetic barcode for their processes. And so ideally, if you can eat seasonal and local, that's the best. One of the worst things for mitochondrial function, especially if you look at the electron transport chain, is a heavy isotope known as deuterium, a heavy form of hydrogen. And so you usually get that from carbohydrates first and foremost, but refined carbohydrates are absolutely terrible for that. And so that can actually destroy your mitochondria, and then over a long enough time frame, mitochondrial colonies. Outside of that, just being in nature. Cold is really good for the mitochondria. If you can get some cold exposure in. Exercise is obviously very important. I prefer to exercise outside as opposed to inside under artificial light for various reasons, because you could actually be building more mitochondria that are actually damaged already. And so that can be a problem over the long term. There's a lot, but I think it all goes back to nature.
And any preference over the high intensity versus aerobic for mitochondria, or just any exercise is generally good?
Any exercise is all good. I think mixing it up a bit is very important. But yeah, as long as you can get in tune with the hormetic stress and make sure you recover adequately, that's bar none the most powerful thing.
You said something fascinating as well about seasonality. We had Belinda Fettke on the show talking all about the demonization of animal fats and meat, and she was talking about the seasonality of eating fruit, and that fruit and that sugar, the metabolism all ties back to the sun and that type of thing as well. And so eating too much fruit in the middle of winter again is out of that natural system that all ties together as you just described. So it's fascinating to hear multiple guests say that from different angles now.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, because if you look at how your mitochondria work, like, they're not picking up on nutrients per se. They're picking up on the protons and electrons within the food. And so that's, if you get down to the most basic layer of it, that's how food is broken down into the system. And so it makes sense that you would want to eat local, meaning foods that are grown within your locale, and also seasonal as well. So, during the summer, I mean, you look at a close to the equator country, and you'll find coconuts and high sugar content fruit, and those things are tied. High UV is inextricably tied to higher carbohydrate content, where if you look at like higher latitude environments, you have just higher protein and fat options available as opposed to sugar and carbohydrates. So I think it makes complete sense from that perspective.
Yeah, and people that eat those diets that are super high in fat and that, they don't have health issues, as you say, if they're eating locally what they've always eat ancestrally and all that type of thing. Nature always works, as designed. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it makes sense. Like, we were never designed to have, planes deliver food from halfway across the world. That just never made sense for our species.
Yeah, that are picked early and then frozen, and then you've added all the pesticides and herbicides. It's just so not natural at all. Yeah. Is there any other topics that you want to touch on, Zaid, that you're passionate about, that you talk about on your podcast, or new research you've come across recently? Anything else? Yeah.
Um, Not in particular. I think a lot of this is really repeating the same stuff in my mind. So I'm getting into more of an area where I'm talking more so about photo aging and skin cancer, leathery skin. Like there are a lot of manifestations that pop up in society that I think are a sign of chronic circadian disruption, along with some other things. But my job is to just tackle those ideas incessantly and just repeatedly because they're just such hard belief systems to overcome. And so if somebody's dealing with eczema or psoriasis, melasma, these are all things that can be solved through the circadian perspective.
Fantastic, mate. Well, I've really enjoyed that. Last summer was probably the first one where I've barely used any sun cream at all. And even those days where you feel, oh, maybe I got a bit burnt, you actually don't. I found I didn't burn or peel the way you thought you would on those days where you wore sunscreen and thought you got burnt. So this has all been a fascinating journey for me as someone that lived in Australia, played cricket all the time, got told you got to cover yourself in sun cream every couple of hours and that type of thing.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. There's a lot of fascinating stuff too. Like for example, when your skin gets slightly red when you're sunbathing, that's actually a hormetic response. That's blood pooling up to the surface in order to start the melanin adaptation. And so there's so much to explore in this realm that it's just it's a never ending rabbit hole, and I'm very very grateful for it.
Well, it's been amazing. I'll put all the links to follow you down below on Twitter and the 2am podcast or anything. But any final messages for people at home, mate?
I would say just get in circadian alignment and don't be afraid of the sun. There's a lot of people who make money and gain power off of selling fear, but you need to empower yourself and really stay educated fundamentally.
Fantastic. That's a great way to finish. Keep up the great work, and we'll have to have you on again in future, mate. Cheers.
Thank you, brother.